Okay, so we had about 100 people RSVP to this, so just giving everyone a couple minutes to join. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the chat, and we can address them towards the end. So I'll just give everyone another minute or so to join, and then we'll begin. Okay. All right, so I'm going to get started. Let me just switch to the right screen here on my computer. Okay, so today's session is about getting started in XR design, and that is being hosted by me, Melissa Schmitz. Just to give you a little introduction about myself, my day job is at a place called Raymond Corporation, which is owned by Toyota, but it's in the material handling section, so it's technically a forklift company, but I work on new technology for that company in the industrial sector. So for the first few years of that position, I worked on a VR simulator for teaching people how to drive forklift trucks in VR, which was pretty much my first dive into virtual reality and XR technology in general. I had kind of messed around with it a little bit at hackathons prior to that, but it was really here that I started to dive deep into the XR industry. And so that was the first project that I worked on, and it's a released product, but since I work in research as a prototype type of engineer, some of it's still not a real product yet, but I tend to work on, of course, XR and automated vehicles, operator assist, that type of technology around automation. With, of course, a focus on kind of UX and human factors in that area. As kind of a side gig that I do once a year, I am a technical director and trainer for the Luma Projection Arts Festival, which is held every year in September in Binghamton, New York. If you've never been to a Projection Arts Festival, it's really cool, and it's also a pretty immersive experience on these big buildings. There are a few of them that happen in the United States, a lot of them in Europe and Asia, around the world. So if you ever have a chance to get to try visiting one of these, I definitely recommend it. Okay. Another thing that I do, I'm a server admin for the XR Design Discord, which many of you may also be in that Discord group as well. It's a really awesome community that was originally started by Daniel Marqusee, who is going to be our special guest today. And he is the XR designer at Bezi, which if you're not sure what that is, I'll let you know a little bit more about that later. But if you want a place to talk to people about, XR design, show people what you're doing, or just kind of see what other people are doing and kind of get inspired, there's a lot of really cool people on there. We have well over 1,400 members. I don't know what it's at now, but it's continuously growing every day. Really awesome people. So a link to join that will be in some of the references that I share with you all at the end of this talk. So you'll receive an email with some of those links if you want to explore further. Okay, so with the introduction out of the way, we can get started with some of the key concepts in XR. So this doesn't necessarily apply to design specifically, but for anyone who wants to learn about XR, these are kind of some of the basic concepts that you need to know. So when it comes to defining what's real and what's virtual, there's this concept that was come up with in the 90s called the virtuality continuum. And this is kind of an academic definition of what different types of reality are. So on the far ends of the spectrum, we have on the left the real environment, which consists solely of real or physical objects. This is called unmediated reality because there's nothing affecting it. It's just the reality that's in front of you. And on the other side, we have the virtual environment, which consists solely of digital objects. So, for example, this could include something like video games. Now, in the middle, we have something called mixed reality, which is really any environment where both real and virtual objects are combined into a single display. And when it comes to mixed reality in this framework, we have kind of two main types of mixed reality. The first one is called an augmented reality, where the real world is augmented with these digital elements. So one place you might see this is video effects, where you have something overlaid on top of the video. There's another one that I think is a little bit less known, called augmented virtuality, where you have a virtual world that is augmented by real or physical objects. And so one really good example of that is a green screen. So you'd have a virtual background behind you, but you are putting like yourself or some other objects in front of that as like real objects. So this is kind of the beginning of how people started thinking about defining like, you know, what's real, what's virtual, and some of the things that we think of today as XR technology. But I think a little bit better framework that's a little more practical for today's purposes is this one, where we have this umbrella term, extended reality, which you may have already known about if you wanted to hear this talk. But essentially, it's an umbrella term that encompasses any type of technology that alters reality by adding digital elements to either the physical or real world environment to any extent. So the lowest extent, I guess, would be augmented reality, which is a digital layer over physical elements. And then, of course, the fullest extent would be virtual reality, which is a fully immersive digital environment. Now, we have this term mixed reality again here in the middle, which we can define it as digital elements that can interact with physical elements. And I want to emphasize the term interact here, because what you see in augmented reality or mixed reality can often look very similar. You might be wondering kind of like, what's the difference? So one example of this is with the app Pokemon Go. If you want to catch a Pokemon using the AR features, you can see a Pikachu. If you wanted to reach out and pet it, they would have occlusion, so it looks like your hand is like in front of it and everything, but it wouldn't actually react to you doing that. In a mixed reality of Pokemon Go, you would be able to like, you know, scratch Pikachu's chin or something, and he would react like all happy or something to it. Or like you could throw a ball in real life and it would see it and chase it. So that interactability is what really makes the difference in terms of augmented reality versus mixed reality. And just to put this in perspective, the kind of ultimate goal of mixed reality would be to be unable to distinguish between what's real and what's not. So this is something that the company Vario uses for a lot of their marketing for their mixed reality headsets, because they make the highest end mixed reality headsets like in the world that use like computing power. We're not going to talk about the Apple Vision Pro with that, but yeah, their whole thing is about making sure that everything feels real when you're doing this kind of simulation in mixed reality. So now we're going to talk about different types of each of these reality, because there's many different types of experiences that you could make in any of these like three categories. So when it comes to augmented reality, the first kind that we have is called marker-based augmented reality. And this uses image recognition to detect a 2D marker where an AR effect can then be overlaid. So we have a couple examples on the right here. One is showing a QR code being used as a marker, and you can place like a little chair on top of it. And for this marker-based mixed reality, you can use, you know, any type of symbol really. So like they show examples of QR codes, barcodes, or even just images. So on the far right, we have this full color poster that is being used as a marker for showing these 3D objects of these creatures. And now, although these are all examples showing 3D objects being overlaid, you can also do this with 2D animation. So if you already have skills in designing animations in 2D, that would be kind of like a fun project that you can do to start off in XR. Now, a second type of augmented reality is called markerless augmented reality, which instead tends to use sensors to detect position and orientation of objects in space. And so this is typically done with a technology called SLAM, which stands for simultaneous location and mapping. You don't really need to know too much detail about that technology, but if you're curious about it, you can look it up on your own if you'd like. But within this category, there are about 4 different types of markerless AR. And the first one I think most people might be a little surprised about, and that's light projection. So yes, light projection can be a version of augmented reality because it can be a very immersive type of experience that alters what's around you. And so this is an example from the festival that I participate in, the Luma Projection Arts Festival, where we have this massive building in front of you that looks as if it's being, it's like moving, the pillars are being split in half and turning around and things like that. It's a really cool type of immersive experience that you can share with other people without having to use a headset or a phone or anything, which I think is really cool. So if you have the opportunity to check out any type of projection mapping experience, not just these architectural ones, but there are also ones like in, I think, New York City, there's a Van Gogh projection experience. There's like a really cool museum in Japan that has some projection mapped type of experiences as well. So this is a cool way to get that kind of augmented reality feel without having to use devices, individual devices at least. Another type of markerless augmented reality is called location-based. And so another example of Pokemon Go here, we have content that appears in the game based on where your location is in the game. So unless you're close enough to a Pokestop or a gym or maybe a spawn point for a particular type of Pokemon, it's not going to show up in the game. And so I do also want to point out that this doesn't have to be a visually based experience. So there are also audio-based headsets, like Bose created some like smart glasses for audio AR experiences, where you can have, for example, an audio tour of a city that is just giving you audio prompts based on where you are physically. So that's a good example of location-based AR. Another type of augmented reality is overlay. And so this is very popular in industry with engineering and things like that. So a lot of people have probably seen this in the context of a digital twin. But one cool industry example of this is in quality control. So if you already have a CAD model of a part that's being manufactured in a factory, you can take that CAD model and overlay it in augmented reality to check things like if the dimensions are correct, you know, if the weld was done properly, or if bolt holes are in the right place and things like that. So it just makes it a lot more efficient of a process. So that's a really good use case for industry. Then we also have contour-based augmented reality, which allows you to kind of see the shape of objects using, which is a very close use case with SLAM. And so I don't have a GIF of it, but there's this really cool example that I heard about where firefighters have these new helmets that they can use in very smoky buildings that will allow them to see the outline of objects, even if it's too smoky to actually see visually through them. So it's a cool example of how, you know, XR technology can actually help save lives as well. So now we can talk about different types of mixed reality. And so there are really 2 main ways that you can access mixed reality types of experiences nowadays. The first is kind of what I think most people think of, which is optical mixed reality. And so this uses transparent glasses-like lenses that overlays holograms into your space to augment your surroundings. And so I put the term holograms there on purpose because if you kind of look at this GIF, this is an older version of Magic Leap's interface, where it's very pastel looking and transparent, like a hologram, right? And of course, that's because you can't project the color black, because black in light projection is just an absence of any light. So there are devices such as the Magic Leap 2 that have some clever tricks and that you can use to get around that fact that you can't project black. So Magic Leap 2 has a feature called selective dimming, which it'll basically create like an outline around an object. And so everything behind that will have this like sunglasses tint to it, so that it gives you that sense that it's like that clear, high contrast image that you'd see like on a screen that makes it look a little bit more realistic. But of course, that's at the cost of, you know, thousands of dollars. Magic Leap 2 is something like $3,200 or something like that. So that technology is very expensive to make. So obviously, the more common type of mixed reality people usually see is pass-through mixed reality. And so this uses the external camera feeds to give that real-time video, just like you would in augmented reality on a phone, but it's displayed on a VR headset screen. And of course, it has the extra interaction with all those sensors in the headset. And so most people know this with like a Meta Quest 3, which is a more popular mixed reality VR headset nowadays. And so it's also about $500, so it's a lot more accessible to people than something like a Magic Leap 2. And then as far as different types of virtual reality, we have two main categories. So one is tethered, where a headset requires a connected PC for graphics processing. This is kind of where VR started with devices such as the HTC Vive, where you needed to plug it into a gaming computer in order to run the experiences. And so essentially these headsets function like a specialized monitor for your computer. There's also standalone virtual reality, where the headsets include internal hardware to do all that graphics processing. But additionally, they also house sensors for what's called inside-out tracking. So in order for the experience to understand where your body is in space, it has sensors on the outside of the headset to detect your environment, so it can kind of figure out where you are in that environment. Older headsets, or certain ones that want to have everything kind of outside of the headset itself, they use external tracking stations for this positioning. So HTC Vive would always have about 2 base stations in a space. And so there's different pros and cons to these setups. So tethered experiences can be really good for high fidelity experiences because you can continuously upgrade like your gaming computer and graphics card and things like that to run even more like heavy duty experiences. But of course, this tends to be more expensive and also can be a little bit more tricky to set up if you have extra peripheral hardware. For example, standalone virtual reality is really great for portability and easy setup, because all you have to do is turn on the headset and put it on your head. You don't have to mess with graphics drivers or base stations or whatever. But it's also a really affordable kind of entry-level experience as well. So there are also headsets out there like the Big Screen Beyond, which some people might see something like a Quest and be like, why would anybody want that? Like, you have to set up all this extra stuff. But something like the Big Screen Beyond just has that really nice small form factor. And it's really great for people who, for example, already have other hardware for tethered and externally tracked VR that they want to reuse for a better experience. So it really just depends on what you want to get out of it. But even most standalone headsets nowadays, you can also plug them into a gaming PC if you want to get that extra quality as well. Now, something that I also wanted to address really quickly that you've probably heard a lot around the Apple Vision Pro, and that is this term called spatial computing. So just as a definition, spatial computing is the integration of digital and physical worlds in a way that brings traditional computing into immersive, interactable 3D spaces. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, that's probably because, it's basically the same thing as extended reality. It's just another term for that. And this has been in the news lately because in the Vision OS documentation for developers, they have very particular guidelines for how you're not allowed to use AR, VR, MR, XR kind of terms in describing your app. So, there are a couple reasons for this. One of them might be that Apple wants to kind of distance themselves from Meta, VR, and that gaming kind of space because they have a different user base. Could be because, they want to describe in a more friendly way, I guess, what they're doing. Because if you see like the picture here, you're essentially using apps and windows that you would on, your MacBook Pro computer, just in a spatial environment. So it could be an attempt at making it a little bit easier to understand for people who are outside of XR. Frankly, they haven't said anything official on this, so all of it's just speculation. You can believe what you want. But the point here is that spatial computing is basically the same thing as XR. So that's not to say that Apple Vision Pro isn't going to do anything really interesting and unique. For example, this image is showing their shared space, which allows you to open multiple apps at the same time. and which is pretty interesting because most headsets require you to go in and out of apps to experience different content. So there are definitely some cool things to look forward to with the Apple Vision Pro, but it's still fundamentally, technically speaking, it's a pass-through mixed reality VR headset, technically. So, okay. So now let's get into designing for XR. I'm not going to talk about kind of basic design concepts that everyone's familiar with from other areas of design, but rather just focus on kind of some of the key differences and concepts that you need to know to create experiences for XR. And so when we're talking about XR, we're not just talking about going from 2D to 3D, because we've had 3D video games and things like that for decades at this point. We're really going all the way to spatial design. So not only are you just designing around the human form, you're not being limited to just the screen in front of you. You're actually in the experience. So naturally, this requires a lot of different design disciplines because you're actually moving in the experience. So this is where ergonomics and accessibility become more important in ways that are fundamentally just different from something like a 2D app on a phone. So these things are important for all design disciplines, but because of that extra physical motion, it really comes into play in XR design. And so because your users are in the center of that experience with everything going around them, this is really fundamentally human-centered type of design. And so now I just want to get into a couple initial concepts that kind of form the foundation of what XR design is about. And the first one is this concept of immersion. So very simply put, immersion is just being surrounded by a virtual environment. And so this can be many different degrees. The Apple Vision Pro actually has a really great example of this with their immersion dial, where you can go from just seeing a screen in front of you to going into a fully virtual space. So, you can be partially immersed, you can be fully immersed. There are different levels of immersion that you can experience. And so this is just a great visual example of that. But as far as, we have immersion, you can be put into a space. Like if you're just put into a black box, you're in the box, but do you really feel like you're there? And that's where this concept of presence comes in. So presence is essentially an illusion of being in a certain place and having that plausibility that you might actually be there, kind of forgetting that you're in the experience. And so the way that you achieve this is by taking advantage of multiple different senses that we have as humans to make it feel a little bit more realistic. And so naturally that makes it a lot harder to achieve than just immersion. There are multiple different senses that we can utilize in our XR experiences to make it feel more realistic and feel like you're actually there. But, practically speaking, I'd say only 5 of them are really used in industry. And it's not because these things couldn't be useful. Like smell and taste could definitely make you feel more immersed in something, but there just aren't a lot of ways to easily achieve that in games. There are third-party sensors, but almost nobody has them. So, it'd be really cool to try like a culinary VR experience, but for most purposes, we're kind of focused on things like sight, hearing, touch, balance, and proprioception. So, the visuals and the sound are kind of obvious. We get touch from things like, vibrational motors and controllers to give the sense of haptics. You can also use external haptics devices like special gloves or vests as well, but most people have access to just the haptics in the controllers. Balance really comes into importance with VR because of the possibility of motion sickness. So if you're not aware of this, part of the reason that people occasionally get this feeling of sickness in VR is because they see something moving in front of them, but they can't feel that motion. So it's kind of the opposite of like when you get seasickness on a boat where you're like moving a lot, but you can't really see where you're going. And then you throw up. You don't usually throw up in VR, but it's a very important thing to like keep in mind when you're designing experiences that, the brain reacts in certain ways to these different sensory inputs. So if there's any sort of mismatch, it can cause chaos. So that's why when you become an XR designer, you really have to think a lot harder about how different senses go into your experience, because there are consequences that aren't there for other mediums. So the last one is proprioception, which really just means kind of like how someone perceives their body relative to different parts of their body or the space around them. And now, since you're actually in the space, you have to pay close attention to that. So these are the 5 senses that are really important to think about. Now, there are some technical requirements for presence. I'm not going to go over these in detail because most devices nowadays actually kind of check all these boxes. But if you go to create an experience for XR, I would recommend kind of looking back at some of these requirements to make sure that you're creating the right choices for like your hardware selection. But for the most part, these things are usually built in. So now we can talk about some examples of what can break presence. So obviously, if there's a technical problem, that can break presence. But when you actually design your experiences, what design choices can kind of break that sense of presence for people? So one example is perceived physical constraints. So this could be like if a virtual space doesn't really tell someone where they can go, if they feel trapped, then it might kind of come back to them like, oh yeah, I can't go anywhere, but that's because I'm not anywhere. I'm in a virtual experience, right? Another example is unnatural scripted responses. So this would be like if you're talking to an NPC character in a game and the responses that it gives are like very scripted, or they just don't really answer your question because they don't have that intelligence. Obviously nowadays with more AI tools, this is going to be less of a problem, but I'm sure we've all had experiences in some sort of game where you're hoping to ask a question and you get like the complete wrong answer. So there are really cool tools out there for this now. There's a company called In-World AI that creates AI characters that you can use in different experiences, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's coming up in the next year with that sort of AI assistance. But the last example that I have here is just mismatch with real life. So if there's a user input that people see and they expect to work in a certain way just because it looks like something they are familiar with in real life, if it doesn't work that way, then it can kind of be like, oh yeah, this isn't real. I'm not actually in this space. So you want to just make sure that you take into consideration some of these sort of things that can make people feel like they're not actually present in your experience. And so all of this kind of comes into this idea of first-person design. But there are some kind of issues that you can run into when you get to this first-person design rather than designing on a mobile phone or like a desktop or something like that, because now the user has the freedom to choose their own perspective. They can look around in any direction they want. They can move. They can navigate in those unpredictable ways. I've definitely worked on some experiences where we had some testing going on and people are just like breaking stuff in ways that like I wouldn't have expected, or even on the other spectrum, just like being so careful with everything that they interact with that like they don't actually like finish the experience. And so yeah, people can just interact however they want to in a VR space or an XR space in general, because there are no physical constraints that really prevent them from doing that, right? So in this way, XR design is unique because you're not just focused on aesthetic or user flow. Like you really have to dedicate your time to directing the user's attention, just because there are so much fewer constraints than in other forms of design. And so one key component in doing that is engagement. And so that's, again, providing constraints to focus user attention in these immersive experiences. And so getting good engagement in your experience is kind of a balance between things like providing people a sense of achievement so that they feel like they want to keep continuing in the game. Because if something is so frustrating and like there's a lot of friction in them completing something, like there's no hints, if they get stuck and things like that, they might just want to leave the experience. So giving them little bits of a feeling of achievement helps with that as well. Also making sure that you place content in accessible locations. So I have some animations on the side there that show kind of like where people can look in, for example, a VR experience. So you generally want to keep content outside, like in front of the peripheral view, so that they can see it and interact with it. And of course, there are different techniques that you can use to direct people's attention somewhere else, like maybe like a glowing firefly or something flying somewhere and they start to follow it, or like a sound from somewhere else. But you want to be careful that you're not forcing people to just like spin around in your experience, because there are some issues with that as well. As well as even just making sure people can reach content too. So that's what placing content comes kind of into play. But the last one is also making sure that you deliver proper instructions, because XR is a very new medium. So not a lot of people have had experience with it. They might need some instruction just to do some things that we kind of take for granted, as some people who might be already in the XR industry or even with gaming. Like I've worked with people who barely know how to use a computer, let alone VR hardware, for example. So good onboarding is really important when you build an experience. And so doing that well would include providing these calls to action throughout the experience so they know what to do next. And then of course, giving them goals to focus on and complete. And again, restricting their available choices as a means to kind of reduce distractions, and providing clear wayfinding to the next task or goal, or even just location, so that they know where to go, especially if they're in a VR experience that is just like this full environment around them. Like if they're in a forest or deserted island or something, they have nowhere to go. You have to kind of guide them. And so when it comes to people actually interacting with experiences, we want to make sure that things feel as natural as possible. So if they go to pick up an object, it should be picked up in the same way that they could in real life. And it shouldn't require specific gestures or poses, unless maybe it's specifically like a magical experience where you're like casting a spell or doing something like that. So generally, direct physical manipulation, where you reach out and grab an object, is better than these gestures and poses. So if you can have someone pick something up instead of select something on a screen, that's always better. And this is mostly because it just requires more cognitive effort to have to learn additional gestures and poses. And so therefore, if you see standardized gestures available for something you're trying to accomplish in your experience, you should definitely try to use them. So avoid reinventing gestures that people already find intuitive or widely understood. And one example of this is this kind of like point and pinch interaction, where there's kind of an arrow in between your pointer finger and your thumb that kind of points to something on a 2D UI. And then if you pinch your fingers together, it selects it. That's something that's in pretty much every XR piece of hardware. So, that's something that you can directly use, that people are already used to using. But that's not to say that you shouldn't attempt to make something better, of course. So one really good example of people kind of arguing over what's the best input is with keyboard input in VR, because it's just famously difficult to do, especially with something like a raycast. That's just like pointing like a lightsaber out of your fingers. Like the further away you get, the more small angles matter, and so it's very hard to accurately select something on like a keyboard that's really far away. So there's some cool examples here, like having these little mallets for like a marimba that you can just like tap on the keyboard while you're using controllers, or even this one on the right side with how you can do more efficient typing in a language like Japanese that's very syllable based, that doesn't necessarily need to have this full QWERTY keyboard layout that we use in the West. So if you're interested in some of those, they'll also be in the resources that I share with you after this talk as well. So next, we're getting onto the concept of affordances. So this might be something that you're familiar with other types of design, but essentially it's how physical objects have characteristics that convey information about how they're being used. So for example, you see a doorknob, and because of its shape, you already know that you can turn it, right? Or if you see a chair, it's a horizontal surface that's kind of at the height that you can sit. So you know that's something that you can sit on. So generally, these well-designed objects, or at least objects that are well-designed, will provide clues on not just what can be done with them, but also things like what's happening or what's about to happen. So, the example on the upper right here, we have someone climbing in a VR game. So the affordance is that there are these like flat tops of the rock that they can grab onto. And so that's telling you what can be done in the experience. So it tells you that you can climb. The bottom experience, on the other hand, tells you that right now a bomb is about to be set off, and you have 20 minutes to until it explodes. So that's something that you can see not only what's currently happening, but with the addition of things like beeps that are getting faster or like flashing lights or whatever, you can see what's about to happen as well. And so generally, you want to make sure that in the experience that you're creating, that users are able to kind of perceive those affordances and instantly understand how to use them. That's like the perfect goal, right? But sometimes things aren't perfect, right? Sometimes people need clues when these affordances aren't enough. So for example, let's say you do have a climbing experience, but there's mountains and cliffs all around you, and you have no idea where to start or like where to go, because you could technically climb any of these mountains, but that's not, you don't have to climb all of them for the experience, right? So that's where things like signifiers and UI tips come into play. So a signifier is just a subtle way to allow the user to understand like what is the intended way to interact with an object. So I have an example from a non-VR game, because a lot of these concepts overlap with things in gaming, right? But you see there's these glowing objects on the ground, and anything that kind of glows on the ground in Monster Hunter means that you can pick it up. And so there's these extra bright glowing lights for like really special objects that you don't want to miss. So it gives people hints, because the environment is so crowded with all these really nice textures of like grass and things like that. So otherwise you might not be able to see it on the screen. So these signifiers can help you see that. This is not to be confused with something like UI tips, which are more explicit iconography or directions that help you complete a task if you're stuck. So this is from the game Cyberpunk, where it's showing you that your target is 10 meters in front of you. So that's a very specific hint of the direction that you need to go, right? So you want to use those sparingly so you can kind of maintain that immersion. And so if people need help getting somewhere, then you can give them that extra UI tip. But it's nice to play with like the affordance of signifiers originally, so that you can give it a more natural experience that feels more immersive. And so another concept here is feedback. So this allows you to give people guidance on what they need to do to interact, and can also increase their confidence if they do something correctly, or perhaps divert them away from doing something if it's something they shouldn't be doing. So this can be done in a few different ways. So you can do something with haptics, where you provide like vibrational feedback. So for example, if you're not supposed to touch something, you can have this like really intense vibration to make you kind of avoid touching it. You can also do this with sound design, so using special effects and spatial audio to convey these different concepts, which, by the way, 3D audio and spatial audio are two different things. So if you're interested in learning the differences between those, I'm not going to talk about it here, but it's just something to be aware of. And then another one is good, of course, is visual. So colors, depth, shape. So in the top example, you see these buttons, they turn orange when you press them or interact with them. You might have like a more realistic looking button, like one of those old fashioned keyboard type of buttons that has this kind of like contour and shadow, so it looks like something that you can press again. And there was a cool example that I found in the new PlayStation 5 controllers. They have really nice haptic feedback where you can feel like raindrops on your hand with a controller, which is not XR, but just a cool visual that I happened to come across when I was online. So I thought I would share that. But feedback is a good way to kind of help people be confident that they're doing the right thing. Now, I also want to talk briefly about curved panels. So there's kind of a debate whether you should use 2D UI panels or if everything should be like 3D and natural. My personal idea on that is that 2D is kind of a transitional form of UI that we can use in XR so that people are a bit more familiar with it. I mean, fundamentally speaking, a lot of our communication over like human history has been like in 2D forms. So I don't think it's something we have to completely eliminate forever. But the point here is that if you want to convey information with panels, it's helpful for them to be a little bit curved so that they are around the user. And so some of the reasons that this is helpful is, first of all, if something needs to be, pulled out of a panel, for example, it will make sure that it's in a comfortable to reach location. So for example, if someone's in like a mixed reality productivity experience where they're working at their desk and there's an object just like way over there to the side, they have to kind of reach way out over to grab it. That's not a good user experience. So you want to make sure that things can be kind of right in front of you rather than just like on this big panel that you have to like reach really far out for. And then also, if you have a lot of text for whatever reason, don't really recommend that. But if you need to have text, making sure that it's kind of around you, make sure that it's easier to read. Text in XR experiences is its whole other rabbit hole of how to handle that properly. But generally speaking, if you don't have to use text for something, then you probably don't want to do that anyway. So, but the point is it should be curved. Okay, so now we're going to move on to design process for XR. And so again, I'm not going to go over like a bunch of stuff that people already know from other areas of design, just kind of focusing on some XR things. But fundamentally, again, XR is like a human-centered type of design where you're starting with the people that you're designing for and you end with solutions made to meet their needs, right? And so I bring this up because this happens so much in XR and people who are new to it, which, it's an honest mistake to make, right? But you don't want your tool that you're using to be the solution because then it can also become the problem, right? So this happens when I see people just like they want to make an XR app. And so instead of thinking about a problem that would be properly solved with a tool or a medium like XR, they just make anything into an XR app. So, if in the case of something like VR, if you do a moving simulation that's not done correctly or just doesn't even need to be in VR, then you can make people motion sick for no reason. And then the problem is that it's in VR and people start not wanting to be in VR type of experiences because they had a bad experience with that. So you want to avoid making it the problem. And to do that, one way you can do that is just asking yourself before you start one of these projects, is my project actually being improved by using XR technology? Or would the experience be kind of the same as a mobile app? So like, could it have just been a mobile app instead? That's a perfectly valid thing because, some people don't have access to XR technology, or even if you're, working on a product at a company, you want to consider like, is the cost either monetarily or just like the time it takes to build an experience, is that going to provide more of a benefit by using XR? As well as things like, can your target audience afford or understand how to use it? Again, I mentioned that I work with some people in industry who aren't very computer savvy in general, like they need help Googling something, and then, trying to give them a VR app, like there's that kind of mismatch that, it's not to say that you shouldn't try to bring new people into XR, but it just means that you need to be very careful about it and just put these things into your thoughts before you start embarking on an XR project in particular. And so I would say some of the best use cases for XR would be, for example, if you want to simulate dangerous, risky, or infrequent occurrences. So one example from my work is with our forklift simulator, we have these lessons that you can use to simulate like emergency situations. So, what happens if something starts to fall on top of you while you're driving this truck, or you're trying to drive into like the back of a tractor trailer to like put inventory on there, and then it just starts driving away. Like, how do you react to those crazy situations? You wouldn't be able to actually test that in real life because it would be, dangerous, or just sometimes it's impossible to recreate the situation too, right? So that's a really good use case for something like XR. Additionally, things that benefit from being interactive, or generally something that you can learn with like muscle memory. So if you're learning how to drive a particular type of vehicle, getting to spend a lot of time in an XR experience, learning how to use the controls can give you that kind of muscle memory for you to learn it better. But really, just as a broad sense, like anything that directly benefits from this blend of real and virtual. So if you can augment some part of their normal experience, like if it can help them, then that's a good use case for XR. Now, some examples of places or industries that are using XR, of course, manufacturing, industrial engineering are using it a lot for training simulations, as well as like medical training and surgery. So if there's a new surgical technique that someone needs to learn, they can try it in VR instead of on a real person first. So that's very helpful. But it doesn't have to be all these like serious use cases either. So if you want to teach a history lesson about feudal Japan or something, it's a lot more interactive and fun to take kids into like a VR experience to like walk through pagodas or something. Or, if they want to learn about a country they can't travel to for a field trip, those are also good use cases for XR. Of course, there are many other ways that you can use XR, but those are just some examples that I wanted to share. As far as techniques for XR design, I mean, there's a lot of them, but just a few of them that I can give you as an example for maybe beginners that is kind of useful for XR design would include like body storming, where you're using physical props in your real world space. It's like you might have like a note that you put in front of you and pretend that's a UI panel and just kind of act out how you would interact with it. So acting out those scenarios, especially like role-playing specific kind of user flows in like VR or whatever XR experience you're making, as well as storyboarding. So, you can use these tools that you've used in other areas of design for XR as well. So just as an example of what storyboarding is, we didn't save the portion. Okay, so this is what body storming is, where you can have these like physical like panels that you made out of paper and like objects, like there's a styrofoam cone here, just things that you can pretend to interact with your body without having to design like a full experience. That's a really good way to just kind of work out some of the kinks of like original user flows before you even start building anything. Of course, storyboards are another tool that you can use. So you can start out with sketching something very low fidelity, and then as you learn more about it, you can make something a little bit higher fidelity. So if you like using paper for this, you definitely still can. There's no requirement, I guess, unless you work at a particular company that requires it. I don't know, that would require you not to use this. But if you think you could benefit from being inside of your storyboard experience, you can use a tool like ShapesXR to go directly into a VR experience and like build something around you. So that's good for just kind of seeing like the scale of things and making sure it feels right before you kind of move on to like a final design concept. But next we'll get into just some tools and thoughts for ideation so you can start making things. And this is the last section of the lecture, so we're almost done. So when you start building an XR experience, you kind of have to pick a side initially. I mean, not to say that you couldn't have an experience that's both augmented and virtual reality. I've seen some people do like really wild stuff with that in MIT Reality Hack, but generally speaking, when you pick a project, you kind of need to pick a side. So if you're a beginner looking to start a project, these are some of the things that you might want to consider. With augmented reality, one thing that's great about it is that there's very limited number of assets that you need to use. So you only need to focus on the ones that you actually need instead of building a full environment. And so because of that, it allows you to focus a little bit more on the interactions and the user experience. So if you're a UX designer, for example, maybe this is something that you'd be interested in starting with. As far as use cases go, it's great for productivity type of apps that can just kind of augment things that you do in your daily life. So for example, you could have like an AR app that's like timers that you can like put in your space, like above these different pots and pans that you're cooking with, so you know exactly which timer goes with which item and things like that. Or even just things for like artistic augments. So you've probably seen social media filters with like, you know, the dog ears or whatever. And so you can do some of those things like that, especially if you're like a 3D artist, then you can kind of display some of your art in augmented reality, which is pretty cool. And so if you are interested in creating a project as a beginner, augmented reality is a good way to just kind of like dip your toes in, because there's a lot less technical stuff required to like initially get started with augmented reality. When it comes to virtual reality, of course, you have to create a full virtual environment, which can be overwhelming for someone who's brand new. I mean, you can find assets online that make it a little bit easier to get through this stuff. But, you know, generally speaking, it is a little bit more heavy on all the assets that you have to include, because you're not just basing it off of the environment around you. And so because of this, you're creating like an immersive experience. So you need to pay attention to immersion and creating that feeling of presence if you want it to be very convincing. Not to say that like the UX stuff doesn't matter. Of course it does, but just relatively speaking, like some of the things that you might put more thought into that you wouldn't on the other one. And so virtual reality is, of course, great if you want to transport someone somewhere else, because that's the whole point of being fully immersed in virtual reality, that you're not in your real space. So that's a good use case for that. Like if you want to travel to the Eiffel Tower or something, but not physically be there, you can use virtual reality for that. And so, you know, if you're up for the challenge, it can be a cool thing to start with, especially if you are really interested in like VR games and you're determined to become like a VR developer or designer. Then, you know, dive into virtual reality. It just has a little bit more of a learning curve to get started. So just keep that in mind. But as far as the tools go, you know, a lot of them can be similar to ones that you use for other types of design projects. So if you want to do some like brainstorming and mood boarding, you can definitely use something like Figma or Miro that you might already be familiar with, because I mean, you're just trying to get your concepts out, right? So this is one example of like a FigJam board that I made for this like rock hounding museum exhibit type experience. Or on the left, I use some templates for like world building to kind of brainstorm ideas for that. And then on the right side, I did like a very high level conceptual, like what the layout of that experience would look like. So, you know, if these are tools that you're already familiar with, you can still use them if you're designing for XR as well. And then I already did mention kind of storyboarding and body storming previously, but so you could do this with a tool like ShapesXR, but you could also do it, you know, just with your body and paper and other friends as well. It doesn't have to be in this space, especially if you don't have a VR headset, because you do need a VR headset for this in particular. Now, when it comes to augmented reality, there are a few that are more platform specific that you could try. Like if you have an Adobe subscription, you can try using Adobe Aero to create an augmented reality experience. Or if you wanted to make something specifically for Apple's AR Kit or Google's AR Core, those are also some options. They do have no code options where you can make cool stuff like this if you're really focused on creating it on that platform. Like if you want to make, for example, like an iOS or Android app, those are some things that you can use for that. A lot more people are probably familiar with social mobile AR, which I think is a good project for anyone who's really beginner to kind of start with, just because they have a ton of tutorials. So this is what Spark AR Studio looks like. They have all these kind of templates that you can start with from scratch, so you don't have to completely make something new. But you know, that's just an example of Spark AR, but really Lens Studio for Snapchat, or Effect House for TikTok, they all have a very similar type of interface. So Really, I just recommend if you wanted to do this, just pick one app that you really enjoy using and then make something for that, because it's a little bit more fun when you can like share it with your friends and stuff like that. And so you've probably seen them before, but these are just some examples of what you could do with, like, for example, Spark AR on Instagram. There's a ton of different types of effects you can use. You can have 3D objects. You can put makeup on someone's face. You can just have like cool camera effects. So there's a lot of stuff that you could make pretty easily with just spending a little bit of time in one of those platforms to just get started. So I have an example of like a project that I did in Spark AR, which I 3D scanned one of my friend's art pieces for her museum because she was moving one of her pieces in an exhibit to another museum, and she wanted people to still be able to see the piece. So the 3D scanning and optimizing that model part was a little bit tricky, and Dan actually helped me with that a little bit. So thanks for that. But when I made this, after I already had the object completely ready and done, all I did was use this like world object template that's in here with this like, geodesic object. I just used that template, and I was able to pretty instantly just make an AR app out of this object that I had. So this is something cool to try maybe if you have your own 3D art, like if you're a 3D artist already, and you want to share some of your work in like Instagram or something cool to try. Okay, and so there's another app that you can use for kind of mixed reality, VR, or kind of interaction prototyping. It's called Bezier. So if you have questions about this, Daniel can maybe go over this a little bit more in the Q&A session. But it's essentially a web-based tool that allows designers to create like a pretty nice, like up to medium fidelity prototype that you can add colliders and different interactions into it. So it basically allows you to kind of make something that can be exported into Unity, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's something that, is more something that developers use to kind of publish an app. But some examples of cool things that you can do in Bezier. On the upper left, there's like a mixed reality experience that you could make. So you can see that real world view outside of you. On the bottom left, there's an example of this like portal project that on the Bezier YouTube, there's like a really easy tutorial to get started with something like this using a couple AI tools. So that's a really fun one to try as well. But you can also use things like a body rig, where if you want to place UI elements like on your wrist or have your hands interact with something, you can also do that in a tool like Bezier. And it's pretty easy to learn compared to some other tools. So it's something that I like to use as well, and I would recommend giving it a try. And so when we get to these high fidelity prototypes that are something that you want to actually publish as like a VR app on like the MetaQuest or something like that, then we're going to get into programs like Unity and Unreal Engine, which are just full gaming engines to create like all the levels and all the scripted logic and things like that for like a full experience. So you can learn this as a beginner if you want to, but it can get a little complicated, and there's like a high learning curve for something like this. So if you're not really sure if you're interested in XR, for example, it might be good to try some of these other tools first before you get to Unity. But if you feel like you really want to dive into VR, for example, then learning Unity is a really good place to start with that. And Unreal Engine is another tool that you can use. It's usually used for like AAA games and stuff like that. And in some ways, it can be similar. There's a learning curve to both of them with their own unique things. But in general, you could use either of them. But I would say currently Unity is used a lot more often. So it's a good tool to kind of start with. But you could learn Unreal pretty easily after you learn Unity, relatively speaking. So before I kind of like finish out, I also wanted to just briefly mention some of these like peripheral skills. So there are some things that, they might not be specifically just for XR, but you still need to consider them in kind of like a full experience. So that would include things like sound design. So adding in special effects, environmental sound, as well as like knowing the difference between 3D and spatial audio. Also UX interactions. So, if you're a UX designer, this might interest you, but like getting deeper into these like different UX concepts that I briefly talked on today, using other inputs like haptics and other alternative inputs is something that's really good to learn as well. And then, of course, 3D modeling and scanning. So this would just be, if you want to create assets instead of having to find them or buy them on a store, it's really good to have at least some base level 3D modeling skills as an XR designer. But if you're not ready for that yet, you can find 3D models online at some of these different websites like Sketchfab, where you can download the models for free. I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them are free. And of course, just make sure that you pay attention to their licensing and credit people where credit is due and things like that. But when you're just starting out, it's perfectly fine to just find a 3D model. You don't have to make absolutely everything yourself. But if you do want to make them, I have Spline in here as just a tool that people already know how to use oftentimes, but it's not really that great for XR because you can't bring it into the same modeling pipelines as some other type of tools. So like Blender, I'd say would be like the most recommended tool to learn because it's open source, it's free, and there's so many tutorials out there that can get you started. And there's a really famous one called the Donut tutorial from Blender Guru, which it seems like it's going to be a simple tutorial, but you actually learn quite a lot of skills with just that one project. So it's a good way to kind of dive into 3D modeling. So not to say that you have to become a full environment artist, but it's good to just know some of the basics, even just for the sake of like being able to communicate properly with other people on a team if you do become an XR designer. And so I stole this from Daniel. I saw this in a presentation he gave recently where he showed kind of like what his workflow is with certain different tools. So a few years ago, he had a lot more tools that he was using with like Procreate, ShapesXR, Blender, Notion, Figma, and Unity early on in the process, kind of in the mid-fi section here. But nowadays, he uses some different tools. Especially Bezier, which used to be called Bezel, but tools are always evolving. So as much as it's important to learn some tools so that you can actually start building stuff, just know that tools do evolve. So it's important to also keep up with some of them in the industry if you decide to kind of take this route. So it's good to pay attention to kind of what's out there. But still, in general, I think the tools that I recommended today would be really good to start with. So I suggest taking a look at that. But yeah, that's kind of the end of the lecture. And so I just wanted to, before we get to the Q&A, I just want to mention a few kind of next steps after this. So, first of all, if you're interested in designing these experiences, make sure that you actually try them out yourself, right? So like, if you see videos on like playthroughs and games and stuff, that has some value, but you can only, there's some extent to where you actually need to start using them yourself. So if you have a VR headset, that's great. But if you don't have access to one, you can try to take one out of the library or things like that, or even just try AR experiences on your phone. It's just, so I do have kind of project inspiration document that gives you some examples of some tools and experiences that you might want to try out as like a beginner, just so that you can start making something. So, use some of these tools that I shared with you today. Maybe make a social AR app or something, just to, dip your toes in, see if you like it, and, get some experience in the field. But as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, some of you came in a little bit later, but we do have an XR design Discord community that I'm going to share the link with as well when I send out the resources at the end after this is over. But it's a really great community that has like well over 1,000 different people in it, and this ranges from like new people who are just learning to experts in the field who are constantly posting like really cool stuff that they're working on. So it's a really great place to kind of learn and, just generally, keep learning and staying inspired to learn new things, because there's just cool new stuff that's happening every day where like I'm gonna have to keep updating this presentation because it's a ever-changing field. So so yeah, thank you for joining today. And what questions do you guys have? Let me just stop sharing my screen so I can focus on your guys' questions. And I'm going to change a setting to make sure that everyone can talk if they have a question. Okay, so first I'm going to just I'm going to check the chat, but I also wanted to introduce Daniel Marqusee, who is a guest speaker here today. He can also help answer some of your questions. I don't know if you want to give a quick introduction of yourself, Daniel.
Oh, hey, can you? Okay, cool. Hey everyone. I'm not sure. My name is Daniel Marqusee. I work here in SF as a product designer. Have been in product design for 11 years. I've been an XR designer for about 2 years, and I currently work at Bezi, and we create spatial. Now it's spatial computing, computing tools for people. We're essentially trying to become the Figma of the XR world, and yeah, just been mentoring and teaching and playing with XR a very long time. So I appreciate you having me here, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So, okay, let's take a look at some of the questions that we already had in the chat. So, see, someone was mentioning Vuforia. So, yeah, there's a industry tool that people use called Vuforia that's for like, that you can use marker-based AR with, or other types of AR if you use like different types of headsets. So that's a cool tool if you're in industry to look into, because they have a lot of cool stuff for like industrial AR. Let's see another one. If it is VR, making a physical diorama really helps you in visualizing and conveying the idea to someone. I built paper and clay dioramas to visualize my VR app before putting my hands on Unity. Could work for AR as well. Yes, thank you for sharing that, Vivek. That is definitely true. So you can see that, like, I think the first time that I saw body storming, I was kind of like, why would you bother doing this? But yeah, it can be a really helpful way to just like feel like you're touching something and get a feel for how it works before you kind of like get into that groove of like trying to build something in like Figma or, you know, ShapesXR, whatever tool you're using, where you're like trying to figure out what size it needs to be and all this like stuff that doesn't really matter. There's this concept, I'm not sure who like invented it or whatever, but instead of using like a fine point pen to like take notes on something, they use like a big fat Sharpie. Because the idea is just to like get your ideas out, not having to focus on like the details of something. And when you use a like really fat Sharpie, you can't like make something very detailed. So that's a cool concept that I've heard people talk about. And Vivek also shared that Unity has some great resources on their website. Yeah, Unity has a lot of videos to on learn.unity.com that can help you get started if you're interested in that. But yeah, what other questions do you guys have? I see Ahana has a hand raised. If you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative. So I'm currently a senior UX, or rather product designer. There are a lot of names for it, but I'm working in the insurance space, and I'm interested in getting into XR. What kind of advice do you have for someone trying to switch from an industry like mine?
Daniel, I feel like this is your wheelhouse if you want to answer this one.
I mean, okay, so let me make sure I state your question out. I think you probably very elegant about how you did it. I would say that, so you're asking, how do you make the transition between I guess flat world to XR world, is specifically for insurance, or just like how do you move between being a flat product designer to a spatial product designer?
The latter, flat to spatial.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of different things you have to take into consideration. I think that spatial world, you have to look at like how do you get a job, or how do you start thinking in the spatial world? And I think that getting it, like the job market in this industry is just like very limited. But it's kind of reminds me when I started doing flat back in product design back in 2009, 2010, and that will grow. But getting to the spatial world, you have to like start understanding fundamentally how to design for 3D space in depth, and that means understanding field, like a user's field of view, central vision, peripheral vision, understanding ergonomics, understanding all of those things. And then for like super hard skills, it's just depends on what you want to do and what kind of job you desire. There are people saying learn Unity, there's people say learn Blender, there's all of these things, but it's really kind of determinant on like what kind of job you want and how fast you want to get it. Now, I've been a product designer for a long time. I've been working at, as a systems designer. I've worked on large social media products and agency products where I've done like literally everything. And there are special skills and there's generalist skills. And at the moment, the generalist skills are probably going to be your best bet. But if I was going to say, where do I start learning? It's just, I would start exploring the world of start exploring and find something that interests you, because learning these tools is not as simple as learning like another tool like Figma. I mean, Figma to a certain extent has spoiled a lot of flat designers because, especially a lot of younger flat designers, because back in the day when I was learning design, I had to learn print, I had to learn bleed, I had to learn, vector-based structure was not as common, but now everything's kind of handled for you. But spatial design is infinitely more difficult, but also infinitely more rewarding. So find something that gives you joy, because once you do that, you can start dipping your toes into the many different hard skills you will need to acquire, but you need something to get you through it. And so if you have a headset or if you have a mobile device, find applications that basically give you inspiration and start doing audits. So like download applications, look at them, screen capture, video capture, start understanding like general affordances and behaviors across those things, and start, really wrapping your head around it. Because like the Z index in spatial design is very, very tricky, and we are no longer designing for a screen. We are designing for the human body and the human eye. And so figuring out how to structure your mind around that is probably the most important. I hope that wasn't way too long of an explanation.
No, it's very informative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and like to add a little bit to that, it does take time to learn these skills, right? So even when I was first working on that VR simulator that I shared about earlier, initially I didn't really know that much about XR in the beginning. So I attended an event called MIT Reality Hack way back in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And I didn't know anything about how to make an experience. I was just kind of getting into it really. And so it can be overwhelming, but I started out by just, at least at a hackathon, for example, contributing where I can, and just trying to get myself immersed in different XR tools and just kind of learning what they do. As Daniel said, you can do some more detailed stuff like focusing on affordances and different design patterns that you can see in these experiences. But really, it's just being willing to kind of dive in and try stuff at first, just so you can kind of get a handle on what all these things mean and just kind of experience it for yourself. But additionally, for people that are maybe looking for jobs, for example, I mean, I see forums where people are or sometimes people are just for general design, they're like, what type of design can I get into that's going to get me a job really easy? And there's no good answer to that, especially in today's job market. So, if you're really interested in XR specifically, you can try to look at different companies that, do XR things. Maybe they don't have a job opening specifically for XR right now, but it's an opportunity to meet people and get involved in a project. Sometimes I work with people who, they might be in a different type of job, like a product manager or an administrative type of position where they just want to move a little bit closer to that industry. So all of those things are perfectly valid, especially adjacent industries like gaming, which is not exactly easier or anything, but there's a lot of different opportunities to get in towards the field, including industrial companies, because a lot of industrial companies use XR. And so don't just look at tech companies, for example, as potential places to get jobs, because that's usually what people think of first. But, you know, first of all, I never imagined working at a forklift company, but I also wouldn't have thought of that if I was just like applying for XR jobs, for example. So, you know, it's good to keep your mind open to different types of opportunities, and just kind of have a goal of moving forward in your career and getting closer to it. Because there's much like anything else, there isn't really an easy answer, and you just kind of have to work towards it. So it is a journey, and but it can be a very rewarding one. So I recommend, you know, trying out XR and seeing where you get with it. So any other questions? You're welcome. You can either raise your hand or, oh, wait. There's a question for Daniel here from Kaya. So Daniel, how did you use your spare time to switch to the XR field while working as a UX designer? For example, find related projects to do after having some solid skills. I'm curious about the conversion process.
Oh God. Well, at the time, let's not beat around the bush. I spent probably $100,000 not working in SF and self-teaching myself this stuff, because there's no courses. So I basically had to teach myself everything. And that was a very strenuous process because there's no documentation on all of these things. Now, with the new human interface guidelines by Apple is very, very good. It gives you a lot of insight. There's a lot more interesting documentation. But it honestly, I mean, the self-education route is inherently difficult. And a lot of people try to go towards schools. And I initially went towards a school. Then I realized quite quickly, like at Circuit Stream, that I actually knew more than within like a month, I knew more than the professors, because I was spending all of my days and nights just focusing and playing with things. So eventually they got me to teach there for about a year. But, honestly, at this point, if you can't afford to not have a job, which is the majority of people, I would say that join a community and then get some mentorship and figure out kind of like what you wanted, like what you can do in your time. Maybe if you can spend, it's kind of like any skill. It's like, for instance, I don't have right now, like I'm learning all the time new skills. So learning 3D, that I spent 2 years learning that, learning cinematography, learning all of these things. And it's like something that you're not going to get right away. It's going to take you a long time, but it's just about building those skills over time. So if you can spare 30 minutes to an hour every, what I call school night, dedicating yourself to just learning something, I think that's important. And just also be very forgiving with be very strict with yourself about doing it, but but also be very forgiving of you making mistakes. And that's one of the reasons why I created XR Design Discord about a year or two ago, is because I don't think people should have to pay to learn those things. And I think it's the best way to learn in this era is through community and exploration. So I think that the best way is just to spend some time asking people and then exploring stuff like that. As I said before, find inspiration and then be like, how do they do this? How do they do that? And you can always hit us up on Discord, and we're going to be doing more events where you can ask these questions and we can tailor those to you. Cause our goal is to remove all of the friction points that I had to go through and just kind of make it easier for you to go by. But I want to be honest, spatial design is incredibly difficult. But as I said before, it's a lot more rewarding, and actually I find it to be a lot more romantic of a medium than flat design. I think flat design is cool, but it's just I find it to be a very intimate and romantic medium. So it's something that keeps me going.
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that too, if you're not sure where to get started, creating a project can always be hard when there's no constraints and you can make anything, right? But just as an example of something else that I made that I just have on my desk, I made this headdress for Halloween. If any of you know what this is from, kudos to you. But some people see this, they're like, whoa, how'd you make that? And I mean, if you really look at it, like these points are all just like squished cones and like half of a circle and like a flat plane. This like crescent moon shape was a little bit more hard to make, for example. So I had to use a tutorial for that on YouTube. But you know, I figured out how to make this. And now that I've learned some extra stuff on here, I'm looking at some of the geometry on here and I'm like, oh God, that was bad. But you know, it's good enough. It's something that, like, this is one of the first or second projects that I made with Blender, for example, that, you know, you can make something that's pretty cool just to get started. So it's totally fine to take inspiration from other things that you are interested in. So like, you know, for me, like sometimes it's like I see this cool thing in anime, or like there's this cool room that I would like to recreate. Like, you know, I want to work on a project soon where it's like I'm making like a really cool like greenhouse space that I can just chill in and like VR chat or something. So you can take inspiration from things around you and just try to create kind of like a minimum viable goal that you can achieve. And, you know, as you go through that process, you might find out that you need to kind of reduce that even lower, but that's totally fine. You know, you can always set aside these extra things that you want to do to edit your projects later and make them even better. But really just like getting started and diving in is how you do it, right? So again, a great way to get some ideas and talk to people is on the XR Design Discord, which I can put a link in the chat really quick too if you guys are interested in joining that. But I will also include it in the email that I send out with the recording after this. So I think we could take maybe like one more question if anyone else has something they'd like to ask, and then we can wrap up. You can either raise your hand to unmute yourself or type it in the chat if you have any additional questions. Going once, going twice.
You can just ask a controversial question. Just ask anything.
Hello.
Hey,
yeah.
there we are.
Okay. So I checked. You talked about Apple's human interaction guidelines.
Yeah.
Human interface guidelines. So I just checked it now. I saw they just updated it with Vision Pro. So if I'm starting, is that a good place to start? Like to just go through the entire yeah.
Yeah,
Is it-
I'm I'm making a video about it. So like it's a good, so the human interface guidelines, the thing that's really good about Apple's human interface. So I'm kind of a documentation nerd. Melissa's starting to get to know me more. I'm a very systemized documentation design nerd. And Apple's stuff is predominantly very easy to understand, vague, but also very like insightful. So yeah, check out the human interface guidelines and start wrapping your head around it. I think we'll probably have a discussion or a talk about that soon. We'll post about it. But yeah, go through it and just start trying to understand exactly what's happening and how they're playing with different forms of space, objects, and forms of immersion, because they are kind of rewriting how things are talked about. But like, they're not going to be teaching things, like they don't talk about forms of depth or anything like that. If you were interested in that kind of hardcore, but also probably vital information, Meta has a lot of amazing design guidelines that they talk about. So, and also everyone in the XRD Discord, I have put together a Notion board full of tutorials, reading content, audits, everything that's completely free for you guys. So like if you just go there, you can look at all that stuff and start learning. Again, like versus you having to do a million different like searches of like not knowing what to look for. I haven't updated but it's still good. Check out my YouTube as well. I'm doing tutorials, but if I was going to tell you anything to get started today, the one thing I tell everyone I mentor and all the students is like, figure out today, or if you want to do today, figure out how to put a box in a room and like into a virtual or augmented room. Just figure out how to do that. And then like that will start getting you to understand like, you know, how to play with depth, how to build things with boxes, because a lot of the stuff you will be building in your career, and I still do, is I usually what we call gray boxing everything out. So you put boxes and getting everything working, and then you, like the aesthetic design of everything is kind of the last 10%. The majority of it is just getting things working in space. So, and you can do that with Unity. You can do that with Bezier. I hate Shapes XR, but you can do it with Shapes XR. And like, it's just all about like, these are just tools. So just putting a box in the room is number one. And if you guys do that, post it in the XRD Discord. I will have questions about like what your challenge is, what are some things you want to do, and then I think that can help push you guys forward.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. I know everyone appreciates hearing your expertise as an XR designer, because like I'm in the industry, I'm more of a prototype designer, so it's always good for me as well to hear kind of what you do on the more commercial design side of things, I guess. So yeah, that's it for today. As I mentioned, you guys, this was being recorded, so I'll send the recording out once I have that ready to share with you guys, as well as some articles and links that you can read if you want to read further. I also have like this document that I share with people just for like inspiration on like how to start projects and like cool things to check out. So all that stuff will be in the email that I send out if you join from ADPList, or I'm also going to share it on the Discord as well if you came from there. So thanks again for coming today, and that's it for now. So thank you for being here.